Always a good day on Sportsnaut when Matt Verderame joins me, the national NFL reporter for Fansided, has a Stacking the Box podcast that you should definitely check out, knows all things NFL, and just wrote a pretty comprehensive piece on the 2022 NFL schedule. The new season is upon us. Matt, welcome. Thanks for being with me.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Congratulations. I know you have a new daughter in the fold as well. So I know that you are sleep deprived. Let's just say that. So we'll make it quicker than we normally do. But let's jump into the 2022 season. Let me just start with a wide sort of question of what's your takeaway? How excited are you about the schedule in its totality?
Very excited. I'm a nerd with the schedule. I enjoy that. I think it's fun to see how everything shakes. I know people that detract from the schedule release will say, well, you know, all the opponents from the second the regular season ends, which is true. But I think it matters, especially for cold weather teams, like when do they play and when are the home games? Like if you're Miami and you're playing Buffalo, you sure as hell rather go up to Buffalo in September than you would in December, right?
Yeah.
Which bad news for the Dolphins. They're in December this year. But I think so stuff like that matters. Going through the exercise and picking all 272 regular season games and then going through the Super Bowl, I think the one thing that really hits home, which is not surprising but just reinforced, is that the AFC is just a gauntlet. I mean, there are so many teams. I think there are going to be really good teams, like legitimate 9 to 10 win teams that don't make the playoffs in the AFC because there are just so many great quarterbacks. There have been so many upgrades. Whereas in the NFC, I think you could have a team that might be the 11th best team, something like that in the AFC, that'll be a 6th seed in the NFC. So I think the balance of power is going to be very uneven in the NFL this season.
So you mentioned how difficult the AFC is. I think a lot of people would agree with you, especially with some of the moves that we saw in free agency that have made some of these matchups really challenging. I think it was maybe you and I that were talking when you said some of these teams are just going to beat up on each other over and over again. And by the time we hit the playoffs and the Super Bowl, it's going to be whoever's left standing. But give us some playoff teams, some new playoff teams, for example, that you think are constructed in a way this year where they're going to have better success than they did last year.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a lot more turnover in the AFC because of all that movement than you are in the NFC. I think the NFC is going to be fairly similar to what it was a year ago in terms of the top teams, Green Bay, Tampa Bay, LA. In the AFC, you look at a lot of teams that could make the playoffs that didn't a year ago. Obviously, Cleveland with their controversial addition of Deshaun Watson, depending upon how many games he plays, they could be better. Baltimore is a team that Baltimore was a 1 seed in November before they just completely fell apart with injury. They could certainly make a big push. The Broncos are a team you'll look at and go, okay, well, they went from Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock to Russell Wilson. I mean, that team could easily make the playoffs should things go right. And they have a very easy first half of the schedule. It's brutal the second half. The Chargers, there are people who picked them to go to the Super Bowl. Now, that feels almost like an off-season rite of passage. Like every year, everybody picks the Chargers to do something, and then they win 8 games. But the talent's there. So, and then the Colts are another team where they won 9 games. All they had to do is beat Jacksonville last season in Week 18. They lose. Well, now they have Matt Ryan. They added some pieces on defense like Stephon Gilmore. So, as it all told, I think there's going to be at least 3 to 4 new teams in the AFC in the playoffs. Any of those teams could make it. I didn't even mention the Dolphins, who went out and got Tyreek Hill and Teron Armstead. And then there are teams that did make the playoffs you look at and go, is Tennessee going to get back in? Even though they were a 1 seed. Like that's the minor gap in the AFC where they could fall from 1 to 8 and nobody would blink. The Raiders, do they get back in? And even though they improved, the division is so loaded. So there's just, Pittsburgh's another one, with Trubisky now at quarterback. Can they make the playoffs again? Tomlin's never had a losing season, but at some point, all good things come to an end. So, I think there's going to be a lot of turnover in the AFC.
What about the Rams specifically? I mean, how excited or confident should their fan base feel that they could run this thing back?
Well, I think it's hard in the sense that, first of all, nobody's run it back successfully in almost 20 years. So the odds are stacked against them. They had an offseason where they added Allen Robinson, but they lost Robert Woods. Odell Beckham they may bring back. He's still out there as a free agent. But they lost guys off the offensive line. Andrew Whitworth is gone. Austin Corbett, who was a guard for them, a starting guard last year, he's gone. They lost Darius Williams in free agency to Jacksonville. They lost a lot of pieces. The weird thing with the Rams and the Bengals, for that matter, I remember covering the Super Bowl back in February, and there was a lot of conversation among all of us covering the game that it feels bizarre. Like nobody feels like these are really the two best teams in football here. Like the Chiefs aren't here, the Bills aren't here, the Packers aren't here. But at the same point, you have to give the respect to the fact that they got there and they won. I think the Rams are a top 5 team. I do. I think they're going to be there. I think they're better than Green Bay at this point. You could make an argument that they're better than Tampa. And if they are, then they might still be the best team in the conference. So I think it's going to be really hard just because it's such a gauntlet and their schedule is difficult. But they are really talented. And even with those losses in free agency, you'll look at them and say, well, who's definitively better in the NFC? I don't know that there is anybody.
On the complete flip side of that, if you look at the New York market where I am and two teams that had statistically the worst seasons in the entire league, you got these questions at quarterback with Daniel Jones, and even Zach Wilson to a certain degree needs to maybe continue to prove himself. Or I know that the Jets did a decent job of trying to help him out, making some offensive picks that could potentially benefit him down the line. But you know, when you assess young quarterbacks all the way down from Joe Burrow down to, you know, some of these other guys, who are you most excited about in terms of watching a quarterback take a leap? Or you think that there's a quarterback like Daniel Jones that's going to finally, you know, prove everybody wrong or assert himself in a way that Giants fans have been waiting for? You know, when you look at the young quarterbacks, what excites you most?
I would be really excited about Justin Fields, except that I'm pretty sure at this point that the Bears are trying to see if he can throw a pass to a vendor because they have not done anything to help this kid out at all. Trey Lance is fascinating. You know, if he plays, they still have Jimmy Garoppolo, of course, in the roster right now, but I would assume that Lance is going to play at some point. If he does, that's a Super Bowl caliber roster. I mean, he comes in with pressure that other guys don't because they're good. But I think right now, like, Herbert, to me, in a lot of ways, not individually having to take the next step because he's been so great, but they need to take a step. And if they don't, fair or foul, he's going to get criticized. It's going to start becoming, well, Patrick Mahomes has won a Super Bowl, and Lamar Jackson's been an MVP, and Joe Burrow's gotten to a Super Bowl, and Josh Allen has gotten his team to an AFC title game. And what have you done? You've never gone to a playoff game. Now, maybe that's not on him, and that's not fair. But as we all know, when it comes to professional sports, it doesn't always have to be fair. Narratives can just be what they are. In New York, I think it's interesting. Look, Brian Dable did a really nice job with Josh Allen, turning him from a really inconsistent quarterback to a guy now who is an all-pro level player. I don't know that Daniel Jones has that in him, but if he has it in him, if he has anything close to that in him, I think Brian Dable's the right guy to get it out of him. They have talent. I mean, that team has guys around him. Saquon Barkley, Darius Slayton, Kenny Galladay, on and on. At some point, you got to make it work. And then with Zach Wilson, he played better at the end of the year. I thought the Jets had a great draft. But the problem, again, is in the AFC, who is Zach Wilson facing that you go, oh, that's an easy game? I mean, there's nobody. I mean, how many – I was talking about the Steelers the other day with a buddy of mine, and I'll point just to use it as an example. The Steelers are one of the most consistent franchises in football. How many teams are they clearly better than in the AFC? And I came up with the answer of 3: Jacksonville, Houston, and the Jets. Well, who are the Jets clearly better than? Maybe Houston? Maybe Jacksonville, though Jacksonville, the real coach, might be better than the Jets. Like that, it's just going to be hard. I think Jones has a better chance to make a jump just because he's going to play an easier slate of games.
So because of what you're saying about the gauntlet that the Jets are going to have to walk here next season, Jets fans should temper their expectations even more. I mean, all you heard around the 2022 draft was how excited the fan base was about getting some of these young kids in. Is there going to be another Darrelle Revis with this kid Sauce Gardner? Oh, they added Garrett Wilson. They need more offensive weapons. But then you heard Robert Saleh go, wait a minute, guys. Like, first of all, these players need 3 years to develop. So let's not place expectations on them that are unrealistic. But you got the sense that it was like this renewed shot in the arm for a fan base that is just so desperate to not stink anymore. But what you're telling me is basically, with how competitive the AFC is, that the Jets could be potentially heading down a path where it is going to be another disappointing season.
Well, I think, look, there's a case to be made that they could be a much better team and have a similar record. I mean, it is a very, very hard conference. I mentioned the Raiders earlier. Mm-hmm. I think the Raiders, with Devontae Adams and Chandler Jones, they're better. They might win 7 games. And look at the division. They're not stopping anybody, right? And I think the Jets, the same thing applies. And the division's not as tough as the AFC West is, but You're not better than Buffalo. Miami went out, they got better. The Pats are the Pats. Look, they're not the most talented team. Hell, I could make an argument the Jets have a more talented roster than New England does.
Yeah.
The problem is who's on the sideline. That team's going to find a way to win 8 or 9 games. It's just going to. Just like Tomlin does with Pittsburgh every year. So I think sometimes progress is always measured in record, and fair enough. It's a bottom line business. But the Jets could be a lot better this year, a lot better, and win 5 games.
Right.
I mean, that's just look, so much of this is on Zach Wilson, too. In this day and age with quarterbacks, if Zach Wilson takes a huge jump, maybe they surprise. Maybe they're a team that they're right in the mix come December. But if he just takes an incremental step forward, that may not be the worst thing long term. But in the short term, you look at their schedule, the first 8-9 weeks of the year, they could be 2-7 or 3-6 and not have played that badly. It's just they're overmatched. So this is a long build. I think the Jets had a great offseason. I still think, though, they're going to lag behind in that conference. It's an absolute deluge of one good team after the next.
I think about Trey Lance. I think about what you're saying about having this be a make or break season for Daniel Jones. I mean, when you see quarterbacks making incremental steps that are positives compared to, oh, wow, this kid had a rookie campaign and now he's shown up on the world stage and everybody knows it, like a kid like Joe Burrow. I mean, is that indicative to you in any way of truly how talented they are, or if they have an ability as a quarterback to get into that upper tier of quarterbacks that are just going to be, generational talents? Or do some quarterbacks just develop differently and you'll see that slow, steady progression of growth, assuming a team will give a quarterback in this day and age in today's NFL enough time to develop incrementally?
Well, that's just it. I mean, right now, look, I'm 33. I remember in the 90s when a guy you got 3 years, period. Like if you got drafted, you got 3 years. And then before the rookie wage scale, if you drafted a quarterback early, that guy was going to get 50-some-odd million guaranteed. He was playing. You weren't getting rid of like Jamarcus Russell. How many years did Jamarcus Russell get? Right? Like Ryan Leaf was the rare guy who got a couple of years and they got rid of. But most of these guys, if for no other reason, from financial reasons, you have to keep them. Now, like I look at the Bears. I mentioned what I think they've done around Justin Fields, which is to say nothing. What if he's not good this year? This is the new front office. It's a new coaching staff. They have no allegiance to Justin Fields. What do they care? They'll just move on if they have to. So that's where I think things are different. And I also think it's unfair. Look, we've seen it in recent years. Some of these quarterbacks have come in and just been unbelievable from the start. Patrick Mahomes, he sat a year. But his second year, he put up 50 touchdowns and 5,000 yards. I mean, this is an MVP. I think now people expect Herbert came in right away and was great. Burrow came in and pretty much right away, you're like, okay, this guy is going to be a top-level player. But then there are other quarterbacks like Tua Tagovailoa who you look at and say, okay, look, he has not been very good the first years of his career. He's also been behind a horrific offensive line. That is not the most stable of franchises. They are now already on a second head coach. They're on another offensive coordinator. Teron Armstead's a nice piece they brought in. He's hurt all the time. What if he gets hurt and misses half the season? Look, I'm not saying it's all everybody else's fault but Tua. He certainly wears some of it. I think one of the biggest things that gets lost in the NFL is, especially a quarterback, when these teams take players, they don't work out, and then everybody goes, well, that guy was a bust. Well, maybe their coaching staff sucks. Maybe they were put in a horrible position to succeed. Look, if Patrick Mahomes went to Jacksonville instead of Leonard Fournette, he's probably still a damn good football player, but has he had the level of success that he's had, except for Andy Reid and Travis Kelce and Tiger? Probably not. So, I think in the end, so many people just expect these kids to come in and be dominant right away. This year, the only first-round quarterback is Kenny Pickett.
Right.
Now, Tomlin's a great coach. Their offensive line is brutal. If that kid steps in there in that division, he's going to get knocked around. That's just the way it is. And to expect him to go in there and play like Justin Herbert is nuts. I think sometimes context gets lost, partially because if you turn on TV, it's always a debate show as to whether or not this guy is going to be the next Joe Montana or if he stinks and there's no in between. I think a lot of it is just a lack of nuance and a lack of context and just situations for these kids.
That is such a great point. It's so situational, and a lot of times it's about fit. And you talk about fit, is a quarterback right for an offense or what have you, but whenever it doesn't work, everyone, the sound machine, if you will, is so quick to peg a guy as just a complete bust, when really it might just be talent wasted because the situation's not right. I've kept you for far too long. I know that there is a small human that probably needs a feeding or a holding or something anytime soon here. So I just want to go, before we go, one more thing. Just tell us about your Super Bowl pick before the 2022 season and why you made the pick you did.
I picked the Bills over the Bucs, and I'm not confident about the NFC side of that because Tom Brady is 45, and despite all evidence, I think he's human. The Bills, I think, are the best team in football. Now, I don't think it's by a huge margin. I don't think the Bengals and the Ravens and the Chiefs are far behind. I think, look, at some point, you got to beat the Chiefs. The Bills have lost to them twice in the last couple of years. But I think with Von Miller coming in, as close as they've gotten, I know they lost last year in the divisional round. That game was a miracle for Kansas City to pull out. It's one of those years where it feels like if they don't win the Super Bowl, you start looking at them and going, is it ever going to happen? I mean, they've been knocking at the door. I think it's a harder road for them because of how tough the conference is. But I also think they have the advantage now of the AFC West. All teams are going to beat the heck out of each other. The same is true of the North. The Bills could go 5-1 or 6-0 in their division. So I have the Bills over the Bucs. The Rams are right there. It's just hard for me to pick against Brady. I mean, even last year in the playoffs, you look at that game, and they're down, felt like 100 points in the fourth quarter, and they almost came back and won. So I'll take the Bills over the Bucs. I'm sure Bills fans would love to see Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. I'm sure that would be their dream after 20 years of nothing but pain.
Matt Verderame, best in the business, does the schedule like nobody else. Thanks for being with me. That's awesome.